Everybody, so happy to see this turnout. I'd like to first welcome Nicholas Kralev, who is here with us today. He had other events also in Egypt, and he will talk to us about U.S. diplomacy in the 21st century, the impact of U.S. diplomacy in the 21st century. Nicholas Kralev is an author, entrepreneur, and expert in international diplomacy, strategic communications, and global aviation. How could you combine all this together? A former Financial Times and Washington Times correspondent, he has witnessed firsthand the conduct of American diplomacy and accompanied 4 U.S. Secretaries of State on their travels: Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and Madeleine Albright. He is the founder and CEO of Kralev International, LLC, a consulting and training firm specializing in international diplomacy, communications, and global travel. He also hosts the TV series on diplomacy, Conversations with Nicholas Kralev. He is the author of America's Other Army and Decoding Air Travel. He is a contributor to the Atlantic Foreign Policy magazine and the Huffington Post, and has appeared on CNN, BBC, Fox News, C-SPAN, and local stations across the US and around the world. He holds a master's degree in public policy from Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government and speaks 5 languages. I wonder if Arabic is one among them?
You're out of luck. No, it's not, unfortunately.
It's not, unfortunately. Okay. Nicholas is going to talk to us about U.S. diplomacy and its impact in the 21st century. Please, you have the floor.
Wait to see what I have to say before you clap, because maybe you won't like it. Well, thank you very much for having me. It is my last day in Cairo because I leave tomorrow morning. But I've had several events already at different universities, think tanks, and this morning we had an event at the American Embassy. My interest in diplomacy originated as a journalist. So I never was a diplomat. I never worked for the American government, and I don't work for it now. And I noticed that the media has a very particular interest, particular and limited interest in diplomacy. The media focuses on typically covering the Secretary of State, in our case, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs in other countries, and also on policy. Policy, of course, foreign policy and diplomacy are very different. Diplomacy is one tool to implement foreign policy. I realize that we focus on diplomacy in the media only when we have these high-level, high-stakes negotiations like the Iran nuclear deal and similar, either negotiations or obviously big summits, or when we had the neighbors of Iraq conferences several times, including in Egypt and a couple of them in Sharm el-Sheikh, but not on the daily conduct of diplomacy, whether American or any other diplomacy. And I thought it was not only important to focus on that, I thought there was a niche to be filled there, but I also thought that there are good stories to be told. Journalism, after all, is about... Well, now you're hiding my face from the other camera over there, right? So think about other people too, right? Thank you. journalism is about storytelling, and I thought there must be good stories that diplomats can tell me that don't necessarily involve the Secretary of State or ministers of foreign affairs, but the people who do the daily work of diplomacy at embassies and consulates around the world. And so with that began my interest. As I was traveling around the world with the Secretary of State, I was meeting some of those people who work in the American Foreign Service. And I wanted to know more about what they did, about them as people, where they come from, how they get ready to, how they're prepared to become diplomats. And ultimately, as you mentioned, what the impact of what they do is on not only Americans, but people in other countries. And in talking about impact, I realized that I myself have been affected by American diplomacy without necessarily realizing that at the time, because of the role that American diplomacy played in ending the Cold War, and then in the transition to democracy and market economy in Eastern and Central Europe. Because I was born in Bulgaria, and I was 15 when the Cold War ended in 1989. And nothing of what's happened to me would have happened had those events not taken place. So later I wanted to know whether other people are affected by American diplomacy and whether that impact is always positive, or perhaps sometimes it's negative. And as Hillary Clinton told me when we spoke for my book, she said that American diplomacy today is actually the word that I'm going to use was used by not Hillary Clinton, but a former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. Her name was Judith McHale. She said that American diplomacy is weaved into the fabric of people's lives everywhere. It's a very strong statement, right? So I wanted to see what that meant. And in addition to all the countries that I visited with the Secretary of State, with the 4 Secretaries of State that, whose names you heard, I visited 77 American embassies, consulates, other diplomatic missions, and interviewed more than 600 American diplomats to get a real perspective, not just second-hand or third-hand accounts, but to see what it is they do, and as much as I could, how they do it. Obviously, as an outsider who was given great access to the system, I could see a lot of things, but also there were things that happen behind the scenes that I don't claim to have seen absolutely everything that American diplomats do, and it's understandable. Just a couple of developments that I've seen in terms of how American diplomacy has changed since 9/11, because there's no question that 9/11 was the most significant catalyst, or the event that changed how American diplomats do their jobs, more than any other event since the end of the Cold War. Speaking about how what American diplomats do affects the lives of real people, because ultimately I think that anything a government does should be in the service of the national interest, but more specifically should benefit the people of the country whose government it is. And there are 2 main components of that national interest: the security and the prosperity of the country. So I wanted to see how American diplomacy contributes to either the security or the prosperity of the United States, or both, hopefully both. So when it comes to changes, one of the things that we consider to be relatively new about American diplomacy is the part of it that is different from classic diplomacy. Classic diplomacy is managing a country's affairs in another country, right? Having a representation and managing the affairs of your country in the host country. A lot of it is bilateral, some of it is multilateral. Because even if you're serving to your country's mission to the UN or the EU or the AU, that's multilateral diplomacy. But sometimes you may be serving in a bilateral mission, an embassy, and still be involved in multilateral issues because of the importance of the country you're in on various issues that have to do with, for example, the peace process, right? Clearly Egypt has been for decades a very, very major player in the peace process. So the American Secretary of State and the Egyptian Foreign Minister, some people here can talk about better than me, when they meet, they often discuss issues that are not specific to the US-Egypt relationship. The main thing that has changed now is that a lot of what American diplomats do, in particular in developing countries, doesn't necessarily fall under classic diplomacy. It has a lot to do with governance. The United States wants to make sure that as many countries as possible practice what is called good governance or effective governance. And so that has become part of American diplomacy. Not in a way, hopefully, to impose Western or American values, and I'm sure you've heard about that. But if the government, the host government, is willing to figure out how to improve the state of governance, and of course that means how to improve the way that the government takes care of its people, including the economy, the job situation, the basic services in that country, whether it's running water or electricity or food, whatever it might be. And now we'll have plenty of time for questions because I won't talk for much longer, but we can debate whether this has to do with interfering in another country. I only will say that it's very difficult to do something for the US to do something in another country if that country doesn't want it, if that government doesn't want to achieve it. And the other big difference is that it's linked to the first one, is that since 9/11, more than a quarter of the American Foreign Service has now served in active war zones. Iraq and Afghanistan are the obvious examples, but there have been conditions, whether in Sudan, whether in Pakistan, particularly in cities in Pakistan outside the capital, where American diplomats have had to serve in very dangerous conditions. And the thing about this is that when these diplomats joined the Foreign Service, especially if that was before 9/11, before 2001, they didn't expect to be doing this. They didn't expect this to be part of diplomacy. They thought they knew what diplomacy was, and they came in to do certain things, and suddenly they were wearing boots in war zones, and instead of holding meetings with Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials or whatever else you think diplomacy might entail, they were out there trying to help an Iraqi province or provincial government put together local elections, or set up a judicial system, build schools and hospitals, sometimes try to figure out how to build or sustain an electric grid to make sure there's electricity, if not 24 hours a day, at least a bigger part of the day. Sometimes it had to do with paving a road, right? Is trying to help a local government in another country to figure out how to build infrastructure or pave roads, is that diplomacy? It's not classic diplomacy. But essentially, that was what these people, these American diplomats who served outside Baghdad, so in whether it's in Tikrit or Kirkuk or Karbala or Basra or Erbil, have had to do. And that changes sort of the psyche of a person, so on a human level. It suddenly is, as many people told me, it was a shock to the system for the American Foreign Service that they had to do this in very dangerous conditions. Clearly, diplomats do not carry weapons. In these cases, they served alongside the American military, but they themselves were not carrying weapons. And the last thing I will say on the changes to American diplomacy, something that we had seen happen before 9/11, but sporadically, ad hoc, and it has to do with what we call public diplomacy. this is what we're doing now is public diplomacy, even though I don't work for the government. The American Foreign Service has for decades tried to engage with the publics in other countries. What's different now that has become, in essence, the policy, that it should be a very conscious effort. It shouldn't be just, when we feel like it or when we think that we have reasons to do it. Now, what the American government decided after 9/11 is that it's in the 21st century, if you want to be influential or to be effective at diplomacy, it's not enough to just work with the government of whatever country you're in as the embassy. That it's also very important to engage with other parts of society, whether it's academia or the media or the civil society, non-profit sector, or the private sector. It's a tricky concept because obviously in some countries the government isn't crazy about American diplomats engaging with civil society or directly with their own citizens, which can be done through social media and other channels. But whether this isn't done from what I've seen, even in countries like China, this isn't done to spite the government, or at least that's not the intention. The intention is for the citizens of that country to have an accurate perception and knowledge about the United States, about the American people, American culture, but also about American policy, right? Because diplomats also implement policy. All this is to say that diplomacy has become quite complex. And unfortunately, I find that many people in many countries don't look at diplomacy as a real and serious profession. And it is a profession, it's not a hobby. It's not something that you can just decide that you're going to be a diplomat, and with no skills or qualifications or training, you can be effective at that. I've had I've seen in many countries people from different fields who think they can contribute to diplomacy, who have tried, and in some cases have succeeded in finding positions in the diplomacy of their own country. In the United States, we have many people who are not professional diplomats, who are in diplomatic positions both in Washington and overseas. But I think it would be very helpful globally, just for diplomacy in general, as a tool to resolve many of the problems we have. And if I don't have to tell you, just looking at a map of the world, of all the problems that exist currently, it will be so much better if we can solve these problems with diplomacy, right? Isn't that always the first tool of choice? And resort to other means only when necessary. So I'm happy to elaborate on any of the issues and aspects I mentioned, or anything else that you want to just talk about that I did not mention. But just to finish, I have no doubt now that American diplomacy touches the lives of people everywhere. Whether it's through healthcare systems that maybe the United States is trying to help improve in a country in Africa or Southeast Asia or Latin America, through efforts that the United States may be making to reduce extreme poverty, or to reduce the maternal mortality rate in a country, or the infant mortality rate in a country, or to help a country improve or modernize its judicial system, its child adoption system, whatever it might be. It's diplomacy, especially American diplomacy in the 21st century, is so diverse. There's such variety in the duties. That's actually another difference, and it's one of the difficulties of trying to conceptualize and explain to people outside what diplomacy is, because you can literally have 15 different jobs during your career in 20 or 25 years. You can have a dozen or more different positions that you hold. at the end of the day, it can be challenging to find too much in common between some of those jobs. Because the variety between classic diplomacy and this new diplomacy, or as Condi writes, as you may remember, well, you remember, Minister, called it transformational diplomacy, right? And of course, some governments were not happy about that. And we can talk about that if you want to. But between service in Vienna or in Paris, service in Iraq or in Afghanistan, service in Cairo, service in Indonesia, you can literally, at the end of your career, it could even seem that you've had 12 or 15 different jobs. But the fact is that all these jobs have been in the US Foreign Service. So I will stop here, and hopefully I've provoked enough thoughts and questions that we have half an hour, right?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. I think it was certainly very much thought-provoking, and I would start with only a query. I mean, it becomes really now not very clear. Is diplomacy still the tool of the foreign policy, or is foreign policy the tool of diplomacy? What affects the other? And how did this kind of new diplomacy, starting 9/11, impact on the US foreign policy? But if you can answer this within answering other questions, I mean, I don't want to monopolize the floor here. Ahmed, yes?
You want me to answer? You don't want me to answer?
Not yet.
Okay.
Maybe we can take a number. What do you think? What do you prefer?
It's better
up
for me
to you.
not to forget the questions to
Not,
answer
so you want one by one?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So we'll go one by one.
Just I'll be brief
It's
on
up to
this.
you.
The link
Yeah.
between I think it's still to me it's very clear that the diplomacy is still one of the tools for implementing foreign policy. But the connection between these new things, this new transformational diplomacy, whatever you call it, the reason for that has to do with a decision that was made after 9/11, which was that, okay, what is the main lesson of 9/11? And this is the argument that the American government makes, and that's not my argument. Before 9/11, the American government thought that there was no realistic threat to the American homeland, physical threat, right? Because we have the Pacific on one side, the Atlantic on the other side, and they couldn't imagine that someone would actually attack the homeland in the mainland of the United States. Clearly that happened. So they looked at, okay, we have this country, Afghanistan. It was what we call a failed state, allowing the Taliban, well, the Taliban was ruling the country. I don't know if it's running, it was trying to rule it. But the Taliban had, in fact, provided safe haven to Al-Qaeda. And so they said, okay, the lesson is that we should do whatever we can to prevent countries from becoming failed states. Because then either whatever the government they have is so weak that the country is overrun by groups like Al-Qaeda and others, and Boko Haram in Nigeria, and so on, Al-Shabaab. Or sometimes they willingly invite or provide that safe haven to these groups. And then they looked and said, okay, so stability is the most important. If we have one unstable country, whether it's because of civil war, whatever the reason might be, then that would affect the region, and it ultimately would affect US interests. But more importantly, it might lead to a situation like what we had in Mali 3 years ago, when Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb had taken over the north part of Mali. And then they said, well, how do we ensure that there is stability? Well, good governance. If a government, in fact, practices what we call good governance, it takes care of its people, provides all the things that I talked about a few minutes ago, then there is a better chance that that country would be stable. Because the people of that country, especially the young people, if extreme poverty is prevalent in the country, if people have no jobs, if people are so desperate, they will try to find ways to survive, to feed their families, and they might turn to then other activities that, whether it's terrorism or other illegal activities. So you can judge for yourself whether that connection makes sense in between stability, good governance, right, and security. But essentially, the government said, 9/11 told us that the only way for our country to be truly safe and secure is for the whole world to be as stable as possible, and we have to contribute to stability in every part of the world. And in a way, that was the reasoning why now everything is the business of the United States, right? If you have to sort of simplify it a bit, but also make sense of why the US might be involved in various parts of the world. Okay, a bit simplistic, but just for the sake of the argument. So, all right, let's go. Yeah.
Ahmed?
The statement that the American policy is weaved into the fabric of people's lives everywhere, I think this is a strong statement. I think it's very true.
Diplomacy, not policy. Diplomacy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And from the movies, from the food, from the culture, from the music, and on top of it, the diplomacy, definitely you could see everywhere. I just wanted to jump into post 9/11 Egyptian American diplomacy. How, if you have few words about the hikes, ups and downs between both countries in terms of foreign policies and diplomacies and stuff like that, as well as the future, how do you see that into the American-Egyptian relations as well? Thank you.
Well, I'm not an expert on Egypt or even the Middle East per se, even though I've written a lot about it in terms of the conduct of American diplomacy. But here's for me the bottom line of what American diplomats should be doing, including through public diplomacy. The reason we have embassies is to build a relationship that would help us when the times get tough. Right? Not just for the sake of having a relationship, but that's important, but because at the end of the day, this is about solving problems, right? In the best of relationships, there will come a time when the times will be tough. Even with Canada, the United States has had episodes that, well, look at that pipeline that Obama rejected the other day. Clearly, the Canadians disagree. But if you don't have a good foundation of a relationship, then how can you go through those tough times and come out with some results? And Pakistan is a great example of that, by the way, because for years we've had issues, not we, but meaning the government of the United States, and several ambassadors in Pakistan tried to build trust with the government and with the military and with the ISI. And it had reached a pretty good level. And then the Bin Laden raid happened. And the government was mad, right? I mean, they were out of their... Okay, I'll stop here. But because they didn't know, right? They were angry that a foreign military operation had taken place on their own territory and they didn't even know it. The Americans said, well, either you... Well, remember what... is it Panetta? Is it Leon Panetta who said that? Either the Pakistani government was complicit or incompetent, right? They either did know Bin Laden was there and hid it for all these years, or they didn't know, which means they're incompetent. So everything that was built over years suddenly collapsed, and they had to start from scratch. So you know better than me what happened here, because the last time I was here was in 2009 with Hillary Clinton. I have not been back since 2011, but clearly there have been ups and downs. Lately, perhaps there have been more downs than ups. But the good news is when things are bad, they can only go up, right? So, but that's why I think political leaders, not just in the United States and not just Republican or Democrat, but political leaders in general should pay more attention to professional diplomacy, because that's the way to resolve issues when it comes to trust, confidence, relationship building. Politicians are good at certain things and not necessarily good at other things. But so I would hope that they would focus more on the diplomacy and the skills that diplomacy brings, which, by the way, includes knowledge of the language, culture, society of the host country, the key players, mentality, right? That's a very, very essential ingredient when you talk about being effective in diplomacy.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Salif, and I work as a diplomat at the Embassy of Mali. Now, I would like to ask you, you talk about diplomacy. American diplomacy has changed since 9/11. And you talked about classic diplomacy. And within classic diplomacy, you have bilateral diplomacy and multilateral diplomacy. Now, on the other hand, what would be the suitable name you would give to American diplomacy today? Is it only good governance or what? That's one question. The second question is, has the media, the role of the media has changed since 9/11? The role of the media in making, a foreign policy.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So on the first question, it might help to look at how the White House looks at the Foreign Service. And you can see that in what we call the National Security Strategy of the United States. Just to bring it down to literally one sentence, in that document, the White House says, the world as it is today isn't what we want it to be, right? It's not stable and prosperous enough, and it should be more so. And then they say, so we want to get there at some point. We want the world to be more stable, more secure, more prosperous. So how do we get from here to there? And then they say, well, our preference is to achieve that state of the world through diplomacy, because people don't get killed when you do diplomacy versus using the military, and then it's much cheaper to do that. And so they say, okay, you Foreign Service, that's your job. But they also say in that same paragraph, even though this is aspirational, this is a world that does not exist, but we want it at some point to exist, we also know very well what the world is today, right? And we know we have to deal with it. So in a way, the dual mission of the Foreign Service, as set out by the White House, is to deal with the world as it is. That's the realism part of diplomacy, right? And then to help make the world more secure and more prosperous, which kind of sounds like changing the world, which is a very, very grand and ambitious role, right? And so as a way to answer your question, at the end of the day, if you keep these two things in mind, as I have, and then I've looked at what the Foreign Service is doing, there's no question that in terms of time, it still takes much more time for the Foreign Service to do classic diplomacy than it does to do this other new, transformational diplomacy. It's because it is the most urgent thing to do, right? When Washington wants something, it's wanted done today, and it typically is not about transformational diplomacy. It's a problem that has arisen with another government that needs to be solved right now. It's also, classic diplomacy is a lot about short term, and this new transformational diplomacy is more about the long term, right? And sometimes these two clash. In Pakistan is a perfect example of how short term goals and long term goals clash. Because sometimes the dealing with the world as it is part is in direct conflict with the aspirational making the world more stable and more prosperous. So it's tricky. It's tricky, and so, as you know better than most people perhaps here, it's not easy to measure the results of diplomacy, and it's even more difficult to measure to have a result that you can see within a few days or weeks or months, right? Often the results of diplomacy are not seen until years after you've done what you've done. Now, I hope that's not an excuse, although I think sometimes it is, for people who do diplomacy. And they say, well, I did this, but you're not going to see the results. Well, maybe if you've done it better, maybe I would have seen the results sooner than 20 years. Economic diplomacy, economic and business diplomacy is an aspect of diplomacy where we can see the results very quickly. Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Reda and then Mohammed.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Nicholas, for your remarks. My name is Reda Shahada, and I'm young faculty here. And whenever I attend or listen to a talk on American diplomacy, I'll be honest with you, I feel quite intrigued and puzzled. There are two schools, as far as I know, that will press for more involvement and a bigger role for U.S. diplomacy everywhere. The U.S. is the be-all and end-all of everything. The other school, the opposite school, would call and cry for non-intervention in their life. In such a case, how would the Foreign Service or U.S. diplomats succeed in reconciling these two opposing trends in conducting their daily relationship with the government, the host government? This is number one. Number two, I know that you have already preempted any involvement, getting involved in the Middle Eastern affairs. Anyway, some people try to interpret whatever is happening in the Middle East as only a reaction to some strategies, some policies followed by the United States. I'll cite the case of Iraq. In trying to trace the origins of the ISIS, so many authors, so many writers traced it to a reaction to the U.S. invasion of military intervention and the appearance of Abu Mus'ab al-Tatar and the establishment of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then followed turning into the ISIS in the Levant and the Mesopotamia. So is it the image of American diplomacy, or is the reality of American diplomacy that's causing such turmoil?
Can we have another question, sorry, because time is pressing.
You think it will save time because there are already two questions in this one.
Okay.
Let me try quickly. On the first one, what you described isn't necessarily determined by diplomacy, but by policy, right? And diplomats don't make policy, they implement it. So it's the people in Washington, it's the policymakers who have to decide the level of engagement or intervention, whatever it is that they're deciding. What the role of diplomats or an embassy might be the level of visibility in that, because if there's an embassy, if there's presence, it's already been decided that the US will be engaged with that country. There's no question about that. But sometimes the level of visibility could be decided by the ambassador, by people at the embassy, but not the sort of the strategic question of whether there will be presence or engagement by the United States. On the second question, it's so, I mean, the origins of ISIS and Zarqawi's role, and it's just so, I don't know, we can talk about this until Monday probably. But, that's a good opportunity.
Dr. Reda is with us. And
when it comes to counterterrorism, clearly diplomacy does not take center stage, right? Diplomacy is not the main tool that you use in counterterrorism because it involves other. We have the toolbox of foreign policy, right? There are other tools in it. There's intelligence, obviously. There's defense. Let's talk more about that in that lunch.
Fine, let's have another last question. Maybe Mohammed. Two questions. Mohammed Al-Qadi and then Abdul Wadud. They're very keen on their bonus. Otherwise, I will not get bonus in this.
Hello.
So you better have good questions, eh? Okay. Go ahead.
Should I speak in the mic?
Yes, please. Yes.
My name is Mohammed Al-Qadi. I'm a freshman in the university. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your talk because it was really influencing. I have a couple of questions. My first question is, what do you think about how the American diplomacy and diplomacy in general are related to achieving the MDGs and the SDGs? That's my first question. Moreover, my second question is, what do you think are the proper or accurate qualifications to becoming a diplomat, and is it actually related to which country you're in and the circumstances, or it's like there are some certain qualifications that are general to anyone? Thank you.
These are the development goals.
Oh, right,
of
okay.
the UN, which
Right. The second question is so much more interesting because there are also misperceptions about it. So let me take that first. It used to be that diplomats were viewed as the elite of the country, whatever the country is. This actually, I didn't want to talk about every change in American diplomacy in the past 15 years because I've written a whole book about it. But one thing that the State Department has decided to do was to have an American Foreign Service that is less elitist and that has members representing all walks of life and all aspects and parts of American society. In other words, to be more diverse, not just ethnically, but in terms of professions that are represented in the Foreign Service. Many people join the Foreign Service having already done something else. Or for them, diplomacy becomes a second or sometimes a third profession. So we have people from who graduated from any university, not just Ivy League schools. We have people who have been journalists and business executives, military members of the military, academics, lawyers, but we also have people who are bartenders or restaurant managers. So I know at least one person who was a professional poker player, which actually helps. We have a neuroscientist. The reason they want to do that is because they want to connect with real people in other countries, the whole public diplomacy thing and the people-to-people diplomacy, or as Hillary Clinton put it back when she was Secretary of State, they think that it will be more effective in connecting with the real people of another country if American diplomats, or if the American Foreign Service, in fact, has these real Americans in the ranks of the Foreign Service. But in terms of other skills, well, I think the first thing is you should be able to live and work in a foreign country. Now, this sounds obvious, but there are many people who it's not for them, right? Because keep in mind, diplomacy isn't just work. It's also it's a way of life. Yes, the Egyptian Foreign Service is much smaller than the American Foreign Service, but moving around every 2 or 3 or 4 years isn't for everyone. Right? You have to raise a family on the go, and sometimes it doesn't affect children well if you have to move them every 2 or 3 years and all that. But then you have to speak the language of the country, ideally. As I said before, know the culture, the environment, the society, the key players, not just in government, but in society, in different parts of society. And at the end of the day, it really helps if you, in terms of influence, because diplomacy is about influence, if you can make arguments in such a way so that you're able to persuade the other country to do things not because you want them to do those things, but because it's in their own interest. That is the trickiest part of it. How do you persuade someone to do something you want them to do, and making the case that it's in their own interest to do it? Yeah. It should be. I ignored the first one, but maybe better go.
Let's have a last question. Yes, over there, Abdul Wadud.
Hi. I'd like to ask about the Iran nuclear deal. You said that diplomacy has definitely changed from the past, and now the Iran nuclear deal bears witness to such a claim. Iran has always been regarded as not a country that really agrees with the US a lot. But they have agreed on that. So my question is, there are many voices that say that the US has not achieved everything it wanted to achieve in Iran for the nuclear project. Do you believe that's true? Do you believe more could have been achieved in other means, or has the US made the best of the situation? Also, does the Iran deal mean that the US can be open to to talking with countries that they didn't agree with in the past, in the future, for example, like not necessarily countries, maybe even groups or entities that they disagreed with? Thank you very much.
The first term of Bush, that was one of the things that it seemed that many Republicans thought that just by meeting someone, it means endorsing their views, which, no. You can meet with them, you can even negotiate, you don't have to agree with them. If you agree with them, you don't need to negotiate, right? So, in the Iran deal, clearly some concessions were made on both sides. I mean, that's what negotiations are about, right? One example would be the timeline of the 10 years and then the 15 years of the different aspects of the freezing of the program, and then what they can do after 10 years and then what they can do after 15 years. And clearly that's been one of the main points of the Israeli government, that after that time is over, then that's what the Israelis and critics of the deal were saying, that Iran will have the opportunity or the right to become a nuclear power. We'll see. I mean, 10 years is a long time, so we'll see. But from what I know from American officials, including the Secretary of State, that was the best they could get. I wasn't there. I cannot possibly question. I can analyze. They're experts, non-proliferation experts and nuclear experts who have offered their own analysis in terms of could the American government have pushed more and got more out of this. The people who were there in the room, the Secretary of State and Wendy Sherman, who is no longer in government, but they were there and they spent years on this, right? It didn't happen in fact, for the first time, an American official sat down in the P5+1 framework during the Bush years. Condi Rice was an advocate of that, and she sent someone called Bill Burns, who was at the time Undersecretary for Political Affairs and later Deputy Secretary of State. He was the first American official to in fact meet and sit down in the same room with the Iranians for the first, since the revolution in '79. So you can, I think in every case we can say, well, we could have done better, yes. But honestly, I don't know how I could have done better if I were, if I'd been in their place. And the consensus seems to be now, and given the attempt this week to put this behind in the US-Israeli relationship with the Prime Minister in Washington, and given that the hurdle in the Senate that was overcome is now also behind us, and this is happening. The Iranians are already doing things, and then things on the sanctions will have to be done by the US and the West. It looks like it'll stick. It looks like whatever was agreed to and negotiated with, this will be it. And yes, there's some other parliaments in other countries that have to say. They will have their say on it, but it seems to be more likely that the deal as it is will survive than not.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you all for being there. I know that many of them have started their class. Yeah, many start their classes at 2, so you have to end here. And thank you very much. Thank you for this very interesting talk.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Yes.